On this very special episode of Trailblazer 2 Traveler, we're going to talk about none other than the Trailblazer themselves. Trailblazer currently has 3 unique forms. Naturally, we can only cover one at a time, and I actually wanted to cover the imaginary Trailblazer for this episode. Break Effect has seen some interesting development in the meta during Panacone's story arc, and it's also a mechanic that I've been closely associating with elemental reactions when compared to Genshin.
And in Genshin, it'd be something
Super break. One of the Trailblazer's mechanics,
like a super reaction.
because Genshin's reaction mechanics are so necessary in the meta, I thought it'd be a really cool Trailblazer brings to the table. I hope you enjoyed this video because I put a lot of work into this. Without further ado, let's get started. Debuffing is a mechanic that has existed in Genshin for some time now. Quite a few characters have access to Reshred effects, and more uncommonly, you can find things like attack, defense, or speed reductions. But while it's something that's existed since the beginning, it's not something that's been properly expanded upon in the meta. So, for this episode, we're going to be talking about Silverwolf and how her kit could be implemented into the game. Trailblazer? No, we're just talking about Silverwolf today. Just Silverwolf. Just Silverwolf. Just Silverwolf. Just Silverwolf. Just Silverwolf. Just Silverwolf. Similarly to my previous video on Kafka and dot mechanics, I'll take this as an opportunity to expand on some of the core mechanics associated with debuffing, and address details that aren't fully clear in Genshin. As always, disclaimers, timestamps, social media links, and music credits are down below. And if you haven't already, consider checking out my overview video, where I cover conversions on the numbers or game mechanics going from Star Rail to Genshin. Well, that's all for the intro, so let's hop right in. To start us off, I want to open the discussion on what debuffing is in Genshin, because HSR has some pretty strict guidelines on what is considered a debuff. There's crowd control such as the break effects of Frozen, Entanglement, and Imprisonment. There's damage over time or dot effects, such as the break effects of Burn, Shock, Wind Shear, or Bleed, and many more like Speed or Resistance Shred. When it comes to Genshin, we don't have a specific label on what is considered a debuff, but we do have a visual indicator that shows us when enemies are affected by one. When enemies are affected by a debuff, they have a set of downward arrows that surround them. I have admittedly spent an hour trying to decipher what would be considered a debuff in Genshin, because I completely forgot the arrows existed in the first place. I browsed endless amounts of forums trying to find a definitive answer, and what I found was that there was no definitive answer. There is a lot of debate online about what people consider to be or not to be a debuff. The reason why there's so much debate is because various games don't label things the same way. Star Rail and Genshin are perfect examples of this because they have similar mechanics that differ in the labeling of debuffs. I will now go through a quick list of some of the questionable aspects you might be wondering about. We can start off by confirming that reducing stats are debuffs. Attack, defense, resistance, speed. That's the most obvious and consistent trait. But one of the clear differences between the two games is that the idea of status effects and marks are not inherently linked to debuffs in Genshin as they are in Star Rail. Let's use Nahida as an example. Usually, you may see a downward arrow after casting her skill, but this is due to the Deepwood set causing Dendro Resistance Shred. If we use her skill without Deepwood, there's no downward arrow. This is the first indicator to show us the contrast. In Genshin, a status effect or mark is not automatically a debuff. By extension, dot statuses like Charlotte's Skill, Burning Auras, or Electrocharge are also not considered debuffs. Which is an aspect I personally found weird in Star Rail, because in my eyes, debuffing should be more of a weakening effect, while dot is just a different form of damage. But there are things I thought would be debuffs that actually aren't. The Cryo Aura is effectively a 15% speed debuff, and Freeze is, technically speaking, also a speed debuff, but with a 100% decrease in speed. But when I applied the reactions, those didn't count as debuffs either. Quicken is a status where characters can deal more damage based on EM, but when I applied the aura, no downward arrow. On a similar note, debuffs seem to specifically imply the hindering of an enemy. Mona's Birth creates an omen effect where party members deal more damage to an enemy, but even if the omen mark is attached to said enemy, it's technically not a debuff. It's actually a buff to party members when you analyze the wording behind it. Qiqi's Talisman is a status that heals allies when they attack a marked enemy. This is something that isn't inherently weakening the enemy, so there's no downward arrow. I did actually come across an inconsistency, which I felt is important to address. If we look at Diona's A4, her burst creates an attack debuff, which is marked with an arrow, but I have my Chi-Chi at C4, which causes marked enemies to have an attack debuff. This doesn't actually show an arrow, even though I believe it should. At the end of the day, there's no character yet whose kit revolves around debuffs, so there is room for personal interpretation. I personally don't think dot effects or status effects are automatically debuffs, mainly because some of those don't actually hinder an enemy, but maybe you do view them as debuffs, and if you do, that's fine. I just wanted to use this section to set some kind of grounding for what will follow in this video, since Silverwolf's whole kit revolves around debuffs. Let's finally move on to Silverwolf's kit. Starting with her stat profile, her weapon will be a sword to emulate the wrist blade she has. I think we could give her signature weapon a special visual effect similarly to Arlecchino's polearm. So with the signature, every other character has a basic sword, but when Silverwolf has her signature weapon, it becomes the wrist blade. For her element, I chose to make her Cryo. Originally she was meant to be Anemo, but when I started doing the calculations, giving a debuff-oriented unit access to a set with a 40% res shred proved to be insanely broken. I chose Cryo because the element does have a slight association with debuffing. Some of the characters have specialized debuffs outside of the standard res shred, namely Diona, Aloy, or Chi-Chi with attack debuffing. And even though Freeze or the Cryo Aura aren't technically considered debuffs, it is still a hindrance on the enemy, which also helps support the association. I figured it'd be cool to see a character who fully embraces that element and role. Making her Cryo also served as an opportunity to discuss her potential to jumpstart the Cryo meta once again, since at the moment the roster is seeing some obsolescence. Silverwolf's stats in HSR are 1047 HP, 640 attack, and 460 defense. For Genshin, the numbers would become 11,004 HP, 288 attack, and 668 defense. Her Ascension set will be a 32% energy recharge bonus to kind of help with reliable bursting. As you'll see later on, depending on your team, she will have some energy needs. Let's start off with Silverwolf's skill. If you press it, she will fire off a cube and inflict a virus onto an enemy, dealing 172% of her attack. Holding the skill allows you to enter aiming mode, with the ability to select who the virus hits. Very important note, this ability is single target. There is no explosion that can affect multiple enemies in a small AoE. Moving on to Virus, it is going to match what it does in Star Rail. At level 8, it will reduce the enemy's elemental and physical resistance by 9.4%. Additionally, Silverwolf will decrease the elemental resistance of an enemy by 20%, and the element will be randomly selected based on the elemental types present in the party. The more party members of a certain element present in a party, the higher the chance that element will get selected. In Star Rail, the probability mechanic works a bit differently. Let's say you have a team of two different elements, Quantum and Lightning. If there are 3 Lightning units and Silverwolf is the one Quantum, the probability of reducing the damage resistance will be 50-50, not a 75-25% chance. This means that in Star Rail, the chances only differ based on the elements present in the party, not the amount of each element that's present. My Genshin take on Silverwolf will remove some of that RNG and make it a lot more reliable when you run more of a certain element. So, running a triple Pyro comp for example, will cause the probability to be 75-25. This creates an interesting dynamic with mono-elemental teams, which I'll cover at the end. The duration of the virus will last for 15 seconds, and the skill cooldown is also 15 seconds. If the affected enemy is defeated while still affected by a virus, the virus will transfer over to a nearby enemy, adapting the remaining duration. This just allows Silverwolf to bypass some of the single target restrictions, as well as her longer cooldown. Finally, the skill will generate 3 cryoparticles upon hitting an enemy. This has no ICD, so if you use Sacrificial Sword, you can use it twice and generate 6 particles at once. For Silverwolf's burst, she will deal AoE cryo damage based on her attack, and all enemies hit will be inflicted with Malware, decreasing their defense by 42.8% for 12 seconds. The Malware ability creates a massive debuff onto enemies, which allows the party members to deal increased damage. I wanted to try out a different idea for the damage multipliers. Her entire ultimate in HSR is a flat 342% multiplier, which isn't that strong in a Genshin setting, but the animation shows the enemy getting hit multiple times, so I figured that for Genshin, we could have it deal multiple smaller hits plus the massive hit at the end. Let's just say the smaller hits deal 20% of the original multiplier, so that's 68.4% at level 8. I'll use the animation from her final strike, and in that section, I believe the smaller hits count up to 12. so her actual motion value on the burst is scaling off 1062.8% of her attack. Compared to other DPS units, this isn't enough to make her a dedicated DPS unit, but it's definitely a sizable increase as opposed to us keeping the original value. Following my conversion chart, Silverwolf's burst in HSR is 110, which means in Genshin we'd make the burst cost 50, and by that extension, the cooldown is 13.5 seconds. For Silverwolf's A1, when an enemy is afflicted by 3 different debuffs, their elemental and physical resistance is further decreased by 3%. This is based on her A6 trace, and it's a very minuscule bonus to her res shredding potential. It's very easy to have this active on an enemy, as long as you time your abilities in sync. This is also a good time to discuss what's considered a different debuff. Initially, I differentiated them on a debuff per effect idea, and that meant getting stacks of this effect is reliant on having different types of debuffing stats. But this ran into a few issues with character limitation, as well as major balancing problems. For example, Xingqiu has a C2 which decreases Hydro resistance. Meanwhile, let's say Kazuha is using the VV set and this swirls Hydro to further decrease Hydro res. If we base debuffs on the effect, this means Xingqiu and Kazuha are only contributing 1 stack of the passive. Meanwhile, a character like Silverwolf or Zhongli, who can provide a universal res shred, are technically applying 8 debuffs, 1 for each element and the last for physical, which means that one ability immediately caps out all the bonuses. So instead, we'll be viewing debuffs in the same way as HSR. This means it's based on the source. Going back to Xingqiu and Kazuha, they both still apply Hydro res shred, but Xingqiu's C2 is one source, while Kazuha's VV is another. So that's 2 stacks. Meanwhile, Silverwolf and Zhongli's abilities only apply as one source of debuffing rather than 8. Moving on to Silverwolf's A4 passive, it'll be based on her A2 trace and her talent. When Silverwolf casts her burst, she will inflict a bug onto the enemy's hit. When a party member deals damage matching the element of this skill's randomized res shred, Silverwolf will also apply a random bug onto that enemy. Applying a bug in this way can occur once every 5 seconds. Enemies affected by a bug will have one of 3 debuffs placed on them. 1. Their attack decreases by 8.7%, 2. Their defense decreases by 7%, or 3. Their movement and attack speed decreases by 5.3%. A max of 3 bugs can exist on each enemy. If multiple bugs are present on one enemy, the effects are guaranteed to be different. Bugs last for 12 seconds and will have independent durations. This ability is an additional way for Silverwolf to debuff the enemies. Using both her skill and burst means she applies virus, malware, and bug. Since we consider these as 3 separate sources, she enables her own A1 passive pretty easily, and if you apply all 3 bugs, it'll count as 3 different sources as well, which means Silverwolf can solo apply 5 debuffs on an enemy. With her kit out of the way, let's cover artifacts next. Main stat wise, you want your Goblet and Circlet to be the standard cryo damage and crit. Attack will be fine for a temporary or low investment option. For her Sands, prioritize her support potential first, so make sure you have enough ER to burst on cooldown. If she has enough ER, you can go for an attack Sands instead. In a solo cryo comp, she'll likely prefer the ER since most of the particles she catches off-field will be different elements, but in a cryocentric comp, she won't need as much. When it comes to artifact sets, she has 2 main options. The first is a 4-piece emblem set for building her as a sub-DPS. This also has 20% ER and a burst damage bonus scaling with ER. Since some of her teams require a higher ER value, this also helps reduce her energy needs. Doing this also allows Silverwolf to deal increased burst damage, which is the best damage source of her kit. The second set is Blizzard Strayer, which allows you to have a 40% crit rate for all of Silverwolf's damage output as long as you're in a freeze team. This gives you an easier time to stack crit damage stats and balance out the ratio a bit more. Rule of thumb, Blizzard does provide higher damage, but Emblem makes it more reliable to burst on rotation, and it's also more flexible in non-freeze team comps. Considering she doesn't have a lot of support sets, this does mean that Noblesse is a decent choice for higher team buffing. It still runs into its usual problems, the first being that Noblesse is only a buff for attack scalers, and also if you're running a second Noblesse user, the effect doesn't stack. Because her debuffing is stacked already, I didn't want to give her a specialized artifact set, because she becomes really broken the more she buffs her team. Next up, let's cover weapon builds. You can choose to go down the DPS route or the support route. I'm going to cover support weapons in a lot more detail, since DPS is a pretty standard listing. As a general guide, picking any weapon that provides attack, crit, elemental damage, or burst damage will be a good choice. For a support option, Something with energy recharge or energy regen bonuses can be a good option if you're not planning to run an ER stance for your main stat. Let's go down specific listings now. For free-to-play weapons, Skyrider provides an ER substat, although the passive's movement and attack speed bonus isn't super good on her. Amenoma is a really good free-to-play option due to the attack substat and the energy regen passive. You'll likely only get 1 stack per rotation, but even so, R5 grants 12 energy, which heavily reduces her energy needs. Finally, the Fleuve Sandra Pipe grants 45.9% ER, plus an additional 32% when she uses her skill. Assuming you run her with an emblem set, the ER you get is already at 230%. It can be a good way to guarantee her burst can be used every rotation, but I think that level of ER is only needed for teams with extremely low particle generation. For some of the 4-star gacha pulls, Favonius can work since Silverwolf will likely be using a crit circlet, and the already existing crit stats will help her generate particles much easier. Sacrificial Sword is also a good option for particle generation. Since her skill is single target, you can use the cooldown reset to better apply debuffs in AoE scenarios. This allows you to use your skill twice to target 2 separate enemies and apply a virus onto both. 5-star options include Skyward Blade, which grants an ER substat, but the actual passive is more for an on-fielder role. Freedom Sworn is a good sword to buff your team's damage through reactions. Its main limitations include teaming up with attack scaling units, and you need to find a way to ensure Silverwolf is the one triggering the reactions. And finally, while she's not a defense scaler, building her on defense stats for peak patrol would be a copium option for damage buffing the team. Because her damage stats aren't amazing, you could consider sacrificing personal DPS for the sake of support buffing. As always, let's move on to her 5-star signature weapon. I'll keep the name as Incessant Rain, since it doesn't feel super out of place. It'll have a 674 base attack, along with a 36.8% energy recharge substat. For its passive, when the user deals damage to an enemy, they apply an Ether Code for 10 seconds. Ether Code causes enemies to take 12 to 24% more damage. Each enemy can only have 1 Ether Code at a time. Additionally, when the user applies a debuff onto enemies, they gain a 4 to 8% crit rate on that enemy, maxing at 3 stacks for a total of 12 to 24% crit rate. Ether Code can count as a stack towards this effect. Since debuffing isn't a standard mechanic, it's not like any other characters immediately pop into our heads. However, the available sword users of this weapon is pretty good, because applying a debuff is more flexible than you might think. There are naturally talent and constellation debuffs which are uniquely tied to a character, but external debuffs can still be applicable. The weapon itself is already a prime example that the debuff doesn't have to come from a character, it just has to be triggered by the character. For example, when it comes to artifact debuffs, running this weapon on anima units with VV will count. Anyone who runs Deepwood can also contribute a stack. Other examples include the Georesonance Res Shred, and any characters who are protected by a shield can apply a debuff there. But even if the user doesn't have an innate debuff, the Ether Code counts towards a stack, so anyone with this weapon is guaranteed to apply at least 1 stack. Bennett can make use of the high base attack, the ER substat, and the passive can provide some minimal support for your team's damage. It can even be good for some DPS units. Lynette generally wants a higher amount of ER, so she can use this weapon to reduce her energy needs while also getting some crit. In fact, running a VV set means a second stack is guaranteed. Also, I didn't really touch on this yet, but in HSR, taunting is sometimes considered a debuff. I'm not sure where it would stand in Genshin, but if you think Lynette's burst taunt counts as a debuff, then that means she's one of the few characters to get all 3 stacks. As a final note for this weapon, it can be a good indicator to know how many debuffs an enemy has based on the downward arrows that appear when they get debuffed. Maybe if we go in the order of 1 to 5 plus debuffs, it'll go in the color order of blue, green, yellow, orange, red. That way, when you target an opponent and want to know if you're triggering some kind of debuff based effect, you'll have an easy understanding with the color scheme. Next, let's go through some calculations and comparisons so you can get a grasp on Silverwolf's potential in Genshin. And from there, we can make the necessary number adjustments. Just remember these are a few examples of her gameplay, and shouldn't be treated as the end-all be-all. Depending on the category, we may focus more on DPS or support roles. Starting off our calculations, let's look at a few team examples to give you a range on her energy needs. I did 3 scenarios in 3 categories for a total of 9 teams: triple cryo, double cryo, and solo cryo. For all of these examples, I assume the following. Silverwolf catches her own particles, but everything else is caught off-field. Additionally, we will assume only 1 Favonius proc occurs in a rotation, which is also caught off-field. Triple cryo teams saw no issues with energy needs. Tons of cryo particles are flying around, and her range looked to be around 140 to 150. Double cryo teams ranged around 180 to 190. Finally, solo cryo teams look to be around the 210 to 220 plus mark, which means in those teams you either have to build a shit ton of ER, or you need to settle with bursting every other rotation. Now that we covered that, let's talk about her support potential with team comps. I decided to cover 3 archetypes. The first is a general cryo DPS, which will use an Ayaka freeze comp. Second, I'll cover Navia to see if she makes double cryo more competitive against the usual double pyro. Finally, a Wanderer team to see how well she works in low energy rotations. The builds for the DPS characters will be free to play or low spender builds. We'll assume a few things for Silverwolf. 1. Her skills RNG will take the average chance rather than assuming she gets the right element every time. So in a double cryo comp where the goal is to get a cryo debuff, the res shred will measure at 10% instead of 20 to account for the 50% chance it doesn't land. Silverwolf will also have her signature weapon. For the first set, let's compare Silverwolf to other units of similar roles. The DPS units have cheaper builds, but since Silverwolf is using her signature weapon, the supports will have theirs as well. For the Ayaka example, she'll be compared to Kazuha, who has a VV set on ER, EM, and Freedom Sworn. We'll also look at Shenhe, who's running a 2-piece emblem, 2-piece attack combo. She'll have ER, attack, and her signature weapon. For the comparisons, we'll have Shenhe and Kazuha paired up as supports, then we'll look at a Silverwolf Kazuha pairing, and then a Silverwolf Shenhe pairing. As we can see from the chart, replacing either support with Silverwolf makes Ayaka's damage output roughly 15% higher than before. This kind of sets the stage on her power level. When looking at a Navia calculation, I'll look at her with a double cryo comp with Rosaria, Layla, and Shilinin. This will be the basic cryo comp. We'll compare that to a double pyro comp with Xiangling, Bennett, and Shilinin, since that's currently one of her stronger teams. Finally, I'll compare her in a new double cryo comp with Rosaria, Shilinin, and Silverwolf. Looking at the chart, a double pyro comp is around 25% better than the classic double cryo comp. But when Silverwolf is added instead, that new cryo comp is around 17% better than the pyro one. Once again, a solid example of her power level. Lastly, I compared Silverwolf with Faruzan in a Wanderer team. For this example, we will assume a C6 Faruzan, since pitting a C0 4-star against a C0 5-star has some major favoritism issues. So how well does Silverwolf work when she replaces Faruzan? And how well is she when she's paired with Faruzan? The first column is a Faruzan, Bennett, and Pyro Flex for the attack resonance. Second slot is Silverwolf replacing Faruzan, but keeping the Pyro resonance. And third slot is her replacing the Flex slot, creating a double animal comp which helps the skill's RNG. From the calculations, Silverwolf's support potential is around 10% better than Faruzan, and if you instead pair them together, Wanderer's damage output is around 43% better, making Silverwolf a very good option for your 4th slot. By pairing the two supports together, you also create some extra energy generation to burst more reliably. That's her support potential when Silverwolf's burst is always active, but let's do another comparison. As mentioned earlier, Silverwolf in a solo cryo comp can get some pretty sizable ER requirements, so it's likely you have to settle for bursting every other rotation. So this time, for this calculation, we cover the average damage in 2 rotations, and we assume Silverwolf only bursts once in those 2 rotations. This means half as much uptime on her burst defense shred. Here, the lower burst uptime, combined with the skill's RNG to make it less likely to buff Wanderer, causes the average damage to be around 5% worse if you replace Faruzan, and only 25% higher if you pair her with Faruzan. So those were a few of the archetypes I wanted to look at. The results speak for themselves, but she is a pretty crazy unit in terms of support. I'll talk more about her brokenness later on, so for now let's move on to artifact comparisons. For Silverwolf, we'll assume she has her signature weapon as a constant, and the 3 sets will be a Noblesse, Emblem, and Blizzard Strayer set. Noblesse is there as a control so you can see how much well her personal damage is when you focus her role into more support builds. Meanwhile, Emblem and Blizzard are the primary DPS-oriented builds. We'll assume attack damage crit for this, and I'll also show Silverwolf's support potential paired with Ayaka. For Emblem, assume Silverwolf has 200% ER for a 50% damage bonus, since that's usually her target range anyway. For her personal damage, Emblem is around 18% better than Noblesse, while Blizzard Strayer is around 31% better. When looking at Ayaka's damage, running an Emblem or Blizzard set reduces her damage by around 8%. The general rule is this: Blizzard is the go-to for personal damage, but you need to ensure you have enough ER and are running a freeze comp. Use Emblem for a middle ground damage level and extra ER stats, as well as generalized team comps. And finally, use Noblesse if you A. have enough ER, B are more focused on support roles, and C are more focused on buffing attack-based characters. Next up is her weapon comparison. We're going to look at two aspects for the categories. First is her support utility for damage, and second is her energy requirements. For the 4-star weapons, we'll look at Favonius, Sacrificial, and Amenoma. This comparison will look at her personal damage and energy needs. Assume she's running an emblem set on attack damage crit stat build, and all weapons are R5. For the actual damage, assume she does a skill to burst combo. Since Silverwolf will have the Fab Sword, we will assume she's catching her own particles in this example. Looking at the chart, because Silverwolf fires an additional shot with Sacrificial, her damage compared to Favonius is around 13% higher than before. Amenoma with an attack sans is 20% better than Favonius. Meanwhile, the energy table takes into account her various energy generation and energy bonuses, and also calculates how much more energy your team needs to generate in particles. In other words, this middle number is Silverwolf's remaining burst cost. The chart shows that Silverwolf's remaining cost with Favonius is only 8. Super easy for the rest of your team to generate. Sacrificial only requires 5 more energy from the rest of your team, which makes it cost 3 less than Favonius. Meanwhile, Amenoma on attack sans requires a 16 energy cost, which means Silverwolf either has to run a team with higher particle generation, or will require extra ER to break even on her burst. If we give her an ER sans for Amenoma, she only deals 3% more damage than Favonius, but her new burst cost is only 10 more energy. And with that number comparison, Sacrificial is actually her best in terms of energy and damage. Moving on to 5-star weapons, this will focus more on her support potential and energy needs. We'll look at her buffing Ayaka's damage once again. It'll compare her signature weapon, Skyward Blade, Freedom Sworn, and Peak Patrol on a defense build just to check out the numbers. I gave her attack sans to Incessant Rain and Skyward Blade since their substats reached a minimum ER requirement. Meanwhile, since Freedom Sworn and Peak Patrol don't have ER stats, the sans will be ER to make up for the lower value. Looking at the chart once again, Incessant Rain provides the highest personal damage due to its stats providing a good balance of damage and energy bonuses. It does come with slightly lower ER, but that can be mitigated through substats. Meanwhile, Skyward Blade has lower damage but also lower ER requirements. Freedom Sworn and Peak Patrol have the lower damage output, but a nice middle ground in terms of energy needs. Next, we'll look at how these weapons buff Ayaka's damage. Skyward Blade's in last place since the weapon has no team buffing potential. Incessant is third since its damage bonus for the team is a minimal amount. Peak Patrol is in second for its damage bonus, but Silverwolf's lower defense makes it hard to max out the bonus. Finally, Freedom Sworn has the highest damage buffing, but there is a major disclaimer for this weapon. Since Silverwolf is a cryo unit, it might be harder for her to be the one triggering cryo reactions, making uptime on the weapon a bit finicky. This is something I wanted to personally clarify, because the chart itself was not able to cover it in its math. But to summarize this section, your weapon choice is going to be determined by what role you want Silverwolf to be in. If you're going for a pure support build, you have freedom to run a few unconventional builds, or pool all of your stats into ER for an easy quick swap unit. If you want to have more personal damage for a bit of a hybrid build, there's a bit more investment needed to find a good balance of ER, attack, and crit stats, but it will provide a good mix of damage and team utility. Moving on, let's cover Silverwolf's constellations. Her original E1 grants her 7 energy for every debuff the targeted enemy has. This stacks up to 5 times for a total of 35 energy. Considering her burst cost in Genshin would be much lower, we have to scale down the energy buff as well. Doing the math, the Genshin cost is around 45% of HSR's cost. Take that value and apply it to the 7 energy bonus, and we get around 3 energy. So, here's a new C1. After using her burst, Silverwolf gains 3 energy for every debuff the enemies have. This energy regen can only occur 5 times per burst cast. Each debuff source can only contribute 1 stack. Since the Star Rail ultimate is a single target ability and Genshin's version is AoE, the last sentence was added to clarify that you still need different sources of debuffs present on the field. You can't have 2 enemies with the malware effect and have 2 stacks. It's only going to be 1 in this case. A little floating number next to her will be a good way to indicate how many different debuffs are present. When comparing her to her C0, her final burst cost is now 8 energy lower, heavily reducing your team's needed particle generation. E2 states that when an enemy enters battle, their effect resistance is reduced by 20%. Since that's a stat Genshin doesn't have, we can use this as a wildcard. Let's say that if an enemy is affected by virus, malware, and bug at the same time, the entire party will ignore 20% of that enemy's defense. It might feel weaker, especially when you compare it to Raiden or Yai's 60% defense ignore, but it's a team buff which balances out in that regard. Both her and her team's damage output increases by around 7% with this constellation. For C3, her skill level is increased by 3. This increases her skill damage as well as the universal res shred. This allows her to deal an additional 10% more damage per rotation compared to C0. Meanwhile, the rest of her team deals around 8% more damage. For the C4, I'm going to switch her E4 and E6. Her original E4 states that for every debuff the target enemy has, the damage dealt by Silverwolf increases by 20% up to a limit of 100%. I will change absolutely nothing on this one. If Silverwolf deals damage, she can get up to 100% damage bonus based on the number of debuffs an enemy has, and this increases her damage output by 64% compared to C0. At C5, her burst level is increased by 3. This increases the damage multiplier in addition to her defense shred. This makes her damage 89% better compared to C0, and other teammates have their damage improved by around 10%. Moving on to her C6, it will be her original E4. This caused her burst to deal an additional 20% attack in her burst based on the amount of debuffs an enemy has, up to a max of 5 times. This basically resulted in a 100% damage multiplier. In Genshin, this is kind of weak, especially with the initial burst change I made, so I'll do this instead to make it a worthy C6. When Silverwolf uses her skill or burst, each different debuff present will increase each individual hit by 20% attack up to a max of 5 stacks. This is the result. Each hit will instead get a base bonus equal to 100% of Silverwolf's attack. This equals an additional 1400% attack scaling when you do her skill and burst combo. This constellation compared to C0 is a whopping 360% higher, and this fully unlocks Silverwolf's DPS potential, all for the low cost of $1,000. Finally, we'll look at some of her team comps. Since Silverwolf's a cryo unit, she's a bit more inclined to pair with other units of her element. It helps generate energy faster in addition to adding a higher rate of getting the right element from her skill. Even still, she's not limited to cryo-based teams. One of the archetypes she has is a mono-elemental team. While mono-cryo is her best one, she isn't limited to that. In other mono teams, you can usually bring an animal unit to VV swirl and buff the elements, but replacing that unit with Silverwolf is also a viable option. Her various debuffs can easily match or even outperform what an animal unit does, and mono teams would have a 75% chance to trigger the right elemental debuff, which is a very good RNG chance for Silverwolf's skill. Even in non-mono teams, Silverwolf's general debuffing is a great asset for any team. Similarly to how Furina is a good universal buffer, Silverwolf is a great universal debuffer. She has low elemental application, so certain teams that rely on specific reactions won't be hindered by her as much. For example, Dendro doesn't react with Cryo at all, so Quicken teams should remain relatively unaffected. Taser teams can also be a good option, and Emily team can make good use of the debuffs without worrying about the burning aura getting melted away. In a similar vein, Mualani Vape teams also don't have to worry too much about Pyro getting screwed over. Of course, classic hypercarries see a lot of new team options. I briefly covered how Silverwolf unlocked new double cryo metas in Navia teams, and while it's a bit of a niche interaction, since Wanderer gets tossed around a lot, the attack and attack speed debuffs can help him tank hits or avoid them much easier. Neuvillette also sees a much needed buff because that dude is just so underpowered. Him, Kazuha, Shilinin, and Silverwolf would be a crazy combination, as long as you have enough ER to sustain all of them. Running a Eula, Mika, and Silverwolf core allows for a ton of cryo particles, reducing energy needs and allowing everyone to build stats in other departments. Overall, she's very flexible in almost every team comp. Cryo teams are where she'll shine the most, but with the right investment, she can function incredibly in a solo cryo comp for some very interesting archetypes. That's basically it for the kit reimagining. I think it's very obvious that her kit is incredibly overtuned for a Genshin setting. In the Ayaka Freeze comp, for example, she was able to outdo the support utility of Shenhe and Kazuha, two of the gold standard units in that archetype. She also power crept many alternative team comps for various DPS units. Pretty clear that a nerf should be implemented somewhere. I've done a lot of number stuff for this video already, so I won't do specific balancing calculations, but I'll go down a list of some of the things we can do to nerf her viability. The most straightforward option is to heavily reduce the defense shred on her burst. Her skill's RNG aspect makes it slightly less viable than expected, and this balances itself out as a result. The rest of her debuffs are somewhat weaker, so it's not a huge impact on her utility, but the burst applies an unconditional debuff and a massive one on top of that. Reducing the value of that debuff would be a good way to prevent power creep. There's also raising the energy needs. I made her burst cost 50 for this video, just because the HSR cost is 110, and I have a little conversion chart for consistency purposes. but for balancing reasons, raising it could create difficulty in energy needs. Increasing energy needs hinders her damage stats and makes it harder to burst every rotation. With that being said, I actually think the energy stuff is in a somewhat balanced state, considering some teams already have 200 plus ER requirements. I really don't want to force her into a build ER only state, because that just becomes a bit annoying. It feels like there's no freedom or flexibility for anything else, and if we don't address it properly, we might end up in a Farazan situation. I considered options like changing her Ascension stat or Signature Weapon off of ER, but at C0 she's not really much of a damage dealer, so it felt weird giving her damage utility when she's not contributing that much in the first place. And all of those steps that would be taken to increase energy needs doesn't address the core issue. As long as you invest enough ER to burst every rotation, she's still going to be broken. Going back to the first point on nerfing her actual talent scalings, doing so allows her to feel balanced, while also allowing her to stay consistent and functional in rotation. You can get more flexibility on how to build her instead of just pumping ER into her stats. It also means that she can work in multiple team comps and you're not forced to run her in some mono cryo comp just to reach the cost limit. But anyway, that's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribe to support the channel. Let me know in the comments what you liked about this design, what you would change, and any other thoughts and ideas you might have. Thanks again for watching everyone, and I will see you all next time. Bye!